So we want to ask you a question to start off this morning. The question is this: do you believe in magic fairies? Come on, hands up. Who believes in magic fairies? Okay, I got a couple who believe in magic fairies. All right, let's start off with something a little bit simpler, maybe that you could engage with more. Who in the room, by show of hands, believes in gravity? Raise your hand if you believe that gravity is a real thing. You are being held to the earth right now by the force of gravity. Did you know that people didn't always believe in gravity? In fact, it was Sir Isaac Newton who came up with this theory in the mid-1600s. And think about this theory for a minute. He proposed this theory to the sort of burgeoning scientific community in England at that time and in Western Europe. And he said this. He said, I think that what's going on here is that there's this invisible force. There's this invisible force that every object, depending on how much mass it has, just pulls every other object to itself without touching it. And then what's happening is that the earth is so big that it's pulling you down to it just by this force that we don't really know how it works. It travels across empty space. Do you know what the rest of the scientific community said to Sir Isaac Newton when he proposed this theory? They said, "You're crazy. You're proposing magic, Sir Isaac Newton. You are proposing that everyone is just held to the earth by this magical force that works invisibly across space." So, of course, he was right, and we have lots of evidence that gravity is a real thing. We don't fully understand how it works. But my first point to you today is that you believe in something that's a lot like magic, an invisible force that holds people to the earth. Next, let's go with this. How many of you have had, this year, either had a cold or the flu? How many of you had a cold or flu this year? Okay, do you believe, now by show of hands, how many of you believe that cold or flu was caused either by a bacteria or by a virus? How many of you believe that that's true? Now think about this for a minute. A virus or a bacteria? What we're saying here is that there is something that you can't actually see that's floating around in the air around you, and that what it does is it comes and it gets inside of you, and it does a bunch of bad stuff and makes you sick. Now, this sounds remarkably like the medieval theory of bad fairies, doesn't it? Bad fairies that just are the cause of whatever evil happens to you. Again, in the mid-1600s, when this theory, the theory of germs, was first proposed, exactly the same thing. Oh, you got to be kidding me. We're back to proposing that there's just something that we can't see. I mean, how many of you know that there's evidence for this, but how many of you saw the bacteria with your own eyes, the bacteria or the virus that caused your cold? How many of you have ever seen a bacteria or virus that causes a cold? Maybe some of you have. Who has? Who has looked through a microscope and seen it? 2, 3 in the whole room. We believe in things that we don't see. Okay, you believe in something that's remarkably like the medieval theory of magic fairies. Now, I'm not saying this to say that you shouldn't believe in it. I'm saying it to say that sometimes there are invisible realities in the world that we cannot directly perceive. But we believe in them if we have good evidence to believe in them. And we're going to see that's what's going on here today in the story that we're going to look at. Because one of the things about the world and about life that's really hard to get a handle on is that God is real even though God is invisible. How many of you have seen God with your physical eyes? Yeah, none of us. But the vast majority of human beings in the world believe that God is real, because there is actually really good evidence to believe that he's real and doing stuff all around us. But it is hard to get a grip on that because he's invisible. And he actually has done a lot of things to help us with that. Jesus, before he left, when he was with his first disciples, we're going to be talking a lot about Jesus today and how he's actually with us right now, doing stuff, even though you can't see him. That's actually real. But before he left, he knew that this was going to be hard for his disciples. He spent a long time actually explaining to them what it was going to be like when he was no longer physically present with them, but he would be present in a different way, but a very real way by his Spirit. So what we're doing right now is I'm so glad you're here, we're in a sermon series this summer at Community of Hope called Turning Point. And in this sermon series, every week what we're doing is we're looking at a different story from the Bible, something that really happened in history, recorded in the Bible, and in each story, it's a story of someone who's turning to God. Some of these stories are stories of someone who never knew God before, and they're turning to God for the first time. Sometimes it's someone who had known God, but they turned away from him, and were very far from him, and they're turning back to him. And then also in each story, you'll see that God is using another person to help that person who's far away turn back to him. And so if you are someone who's not sure if God is real or not sure if Jesus really is God, who he says he is, if you're not sure about that, it is great that you're here today. Because you're going to see what happened. In this case, today's story is going to be about this guy named Saul. This is actually the most famous turning point story in the whole Bible. It's about a guy named Saul who eventually would become known as Paul, and how he, just out of nowhere, he had no plan to become a follower of Jesus, but how God did something in his life, and then he turned to Jesus and lived the rest of his life for Jesus. So if you're here today, you're not sure who Jesus is or if Jesus is real, this is a fantastic day for you to be here. And if you're here today and you follow Jesus for a long time, we're going to be looking at another man in this story who helped Saul. And that man is named Ananias, and we're going to see in his life how he actually had what we talk about all the time, a relationship with God. And that relationship in this case actually turns out to be a conversational one. He is talking with God, and he hears God talking to him. And we're going to get into that. We're not going to go too crazy, but we're going to get into that a little bit. What does it mean to actually hear God? So if you are here today, you've been trying to follow Jesus for a long time, but you're not sure maybe how to hear God's voice, or if you ever have, this is a great day for you to be here. So in your bulletins, you've got an insert that has some notes. You can go ahead and pull that out. We're going to get the first one going here just as we begin the message. The first point in your bulletin that you can fill in is this, and this is the point that's going to come out of this whole story we're looking at. The Lord Jesus is doing things around you right now. Even though you can't see it, just like the gravity is holding you to the earth right now, even though you can't see it and can't really even prove on your own that that's true right now. You can't really prove it, but that's true. And there's good evidence to believe it if we dig deep enough. Just like that, Jesus is actually here right now by his Spirit doing things right around you. And there is good evidence to believe it, and we're going to get into that. Second, just like germs, there are germs in the air. How many of you know that? How many of you put on hand sanitizer as you came into church today? There is some out there. I don't think anybody uses it. But germs are real, and they make us sick, even though we can't see them. They're weird little fairy-like things floating around in the air around us. And they make us sick, and that's real, even though we can't see it or prove it right now. Just like that, Jesus is actually here right around you, doing things right now. Although he's not doing bad things. He's not trying to make you sick. He's trying to help you. He's trying to help you become who you were made to be and draw you closer to him. So let's dive into the story today. And this story, we're going to look at Saul and what happens to him. And we'll be reading the story quite extensively from the Bible today, and then talking about what it means. And I also have a couple of stories to help you relate that to our lives right now. So first we'll be looking at Saul, which is the first part of the story, what happened to him, who he was. And then we'll look at Ananias, who is the guy who helps him. And what happens to him? He's the guy who already has a relationship with God. And then at the end, we'll draw a few conclusions. We'll talk about how we might actually be able, and if we're able, and how to hear God in our own lives. And then we'll draw a couple of conclusions, and we'll wrap up. Okay, so let's start off talking a little bit about Saul. And the first thing I want to do, I'm going to use a couple of different parts of the Bible to give us some background for him, who this guy was. So we're talking about the early 1st century. So when this story that we're going to get into in a minute, when it occurs, is maybe just a little while after Jesus was crucified and came back to life from the dead. Maybe 5 years after that, maybe 10 years, something like that. So we're in the 30s AD. Okay, but first I want to go into Philippians chapter 3. And this is a letter that Paul wrote. I'm going to read a little bit for you from Philippians chapter 3, starting at verse 4. And this is a letter Paul wrote just talking about who he was when he was still called Saul, before he came to follow Jesus, and what happened to him. He doesn't give the details here, but he shows what happened to his whole life when he turned to follow Jesus. So it starts off like this. He says, "Others may brag about themselves, but I have more reason to brag than anyone else." So he was a pretty prideful guy before he came to follow Jesus. His life was really successful, shaping up really well as a young man. And some of these things he's about to say are particular to his culture, but they all speak of success. "I was circumcised when I was 8 days old." That's something in their culture that was very important. "I am from the nation of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin." Okay, so he was from a really good family. "I am a true Hebrew. As a Pharisee," so he was a Pharisee, "I strictly obeyed the law of Moses." So he was not only from a good family, but he lived a really exemplary life within his culture. Really great job that he had, highly successful. "I strictly observed the law of Moses. I was so eager that I even made trouble for the church." So he was actually fighting against people who were followers of Jesus. And that was something that made him very popular within his culture, something everybody thought was the right thing to do. "I did everything that the law demands in order to please God." So if we were going to think of Paul, or Saul as he was known then, today, we would think of him as someone who, born into a great family, wealthy, got the best education, really, as a young man, becoming very, very successful in the field that he was going into, looked at by everyone around him as very, very successful. And what happens to him in the story that we're going to get to in a minute completely obliterates everything in his life. It is a dramatic turning point for him. He will no longer be going in the direction that he was going in. And here's what he says about that. He kind of skips over the details of the story in this letter and just shows the results of it. We're going to get to the story in just a second. He says, verse 7, "But Christ has shown me that what I once thought was valuable is actually worthless." Something happened in his life that made him see that all of that successful, awesome stuff he had in his life was worthless. It was like nothing compared to something else. "Nothing is as wonderful as knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord." Knowing him. "I have given up everything and count it all as garbage." Those things that he's talking about are not actually bad things, but compared to knowing the person of Jesus, they are like nothing to him. Once he had seen, "All I want," he says, "is Christ." All I want is Christ. So what in the world happened to this guy named Saul? Let's jump into the story. I'll read it for you, and then we'll talk about it. I might throw in a couple little pieces of commentary as we read through it, just because I like to do that, and I like to keep you awake as well. So stay awake as we do this. All right. So we're in Acts, the book of Acts, which was written by Luke. We spent a lot of time looking at Luke's other book earlier in the year. Let's look at Acts 9, chapter 9, starting at the first verse. Here's what happened to Saul. Remember, he's attacking people who are following Jesus. And this is just a few years after Jesus had died and then rose from the dead. But most people didn't believe that he had actually come back to life, rose from the dead. So here's what it says. Saul, that's the same guy we just read a letter from, he kept on threatening to kill the Lord's followers. He even went to the high priest, so he goes to the authorities, and he asked for letters to their leaders in Damascus. And he did this because he wanted to arrest them and take to Jerusalem any man or woman who accepted the Lord's way. So Saul at this time probably lived in Damascus, which is an interesting thing. And he goes to Jerusalem, which is like the capital city, and he gets this authority from the leaders there to go. And so he gets some armed guys to come with him, and he goes back to his hometown to find anybody who's following Jesus and arrest them. And then they can, take them to trial, or maybe, beat them up a little, get them to stop this because he thinks it's the wrong thing to do. But when Saul had almost reached Damascus, so he's on his way back to the city he's currently living in, and here's what happens. A bright light from heaven suddenly flashed around him. Now, this was something that had never happened to Saul before, something that he believed could happen, I suppose, but it was not something that he expected. There seems to be no warning at this point. He's walking or maybe traveling on a donkey or horse along the road, and suddenly a bright light from heaven, as he later describes it, flashes around him. And he falls to the ground. Now, you notice what this experience must have felt like if he falls to the ground when this happens. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice that said to him this, "Saul, Saul, why are you so cruel to me?" Or in another translation, "Why are you persecuting me?" Or in another translation, "Why are you attacking me?" Now, could you imagine? You're going along in your life and you're just doing what you think is the very best things to do. You think you're being really successful in your life. You have whatever your career is. You're working really hard at it. You're at work. See, he's at work here. He's going to arrest Christians. That's his job. He's at work. He's doing what he thinks he's supposed to do. And all of a sudden, he has this incredible experience. And this voice literally comes out of thin air to him and says to him, "Why are you attacking me?" What would your first question be if that happened to you? Your first question might be, "Who in the world are you?" Right? And this is exactly what Saul says, right? He says to this voice, he says, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you, Lord?" is actually what he says. Or, "Who are you, sir?" He recognizes that this voice might be someone kind of important. He doesn't know what's happening to him right at this moment. This voice that comes out of this bright light says to him, "I am Jesus. I am the one you are attacking. Now get up and go into the city where you will be told what to do." Now listen to this. We hear a few more details about what's going on here. The men who were with Saul stood there speechless. Yeah, no kidding. What would you say if... The text, this is not a made-up story. What Luke is telling us here is that this actually happened. If this really happened in front of you, how would you react? You would be in stunned silence. You would not know what to think about it, actually. You would be trying to come up with, what actually did I just experience? I'm not sure. Especially since, as we read next, these men, they heard the voice. They had heard the voice, but they had not seen anyone. Saul got up from the ground, and when he opened his eyes, he could not see a thing. He was blind. So someone led him by the hand to Damascus, and for 3 days he was blind, and he did not eat or drink. So a couple of points that I want to emphasize here in this first part of the story. This is something, not this specifically, God appearing in a bright light and speaking in a voice. It does happen a number of times in the Bible. But the kind of thing that's happening here, where someone was just going along with their life, and all of a sudden, God interrupts their life. This happens over and over again in the Bible. And actually, it happens over and over again in the lives of people in the world today, in the lives of people all around you, in your life. It has probably happened. And one of the big questions is, did you recognize it and how did you respond to it? Now, it happens here to Saul in a much more dramatic way than it happens to most people. I will admit that. Most of us in the world have not seen a bright light from heaven or heard a voice. Was the voice audible? I mean, that's actually a question here. The men who were with Saul heard something, but they did not hear the same words that Saul heard. The voice was something that happened physically in some way. There was some sound and some light. But I think actually the words that were communicated to him were communicated in some other way. Some other sort of invisible, non-physical way. All right? So it is true that this doesn't happen to everyone every day. But what is happening here in the Bible is that a highlight moment is being presented to us. One of those moments that we can rest our faith on, actually, because it's quite certain that it happened. Saul's whole life changed after this, and there's no other reason that he would have changed his life. He doesn't gain anything by this. In fact, what he gains is a life of really hard work and suffering. Although he does gain this incredible joy, as he calls it, of knowing this person called Jesus. But his main point here is, look, and he'll use it later this way in a speech that he gives in front of a whole trial, a whole government officials and their court later on in his life. He gives this speech and he tells what happened in this story the same way. And he says, look, I wasn't expecting this. This isn't something I was seeking. I was actually going completely the other way, and this just happened to me. And there are many, many people in the world today who, even though they didn't have quite the same experience, can say the same thing. My life was going this direction. I wasn't expecting to be turned toward God, but this thing just happened to me. In fact, in my life, I could say the same thing. Although much less dramatic than Saul's story, when I was 20 years old, something just happened to me. I was not moving toward God. I was reading the Bible when it happened, and we'll be talking about a little bit later how the Bible is actually one of the ways that God can speak to us. And I don't mean just because of what it says. I mean that he, in a powerful way that's invisible, often speaks to us through the words that are in the Bible. I was in my room by myself, searching for the meaning of life, reading some of the Gospels, reading some of the words of Jesus, and an experience happened to me that has really only happened to me one time in my life. And in that experience, it was not an audible voice, but it was something that overwhelmed me and was clearly from outside of me. And it said, you need to follow this person who is Jesus, because what he says is true, and he is my son. And that experience was so surprising to me that I stood up out of my chair. I kind of freaked out. I didn't know what to make of it. For weeks, months, I spent trying to analyze this experience. Was it real? What happened to me? Why did it happen? Was I hallucinating, or is God actually real? But I kept on coming back to this, that I couldn't get away from this feeling that was deeper actually than my own thoughts, that God is real. I know it now. And my life was headed a different direction. And all of a sudden, everything that I had been pursuing was suddenly without meaning, because I realized something was true about the world. Something was true about the world that was deeper than anything I had been pursuing. And what's true about the world is that there's this guy named Jesus who came back to life from the dead, and he's actually still alive. And you can communicate with him, and that's kind of bizarre. I fully admit that it's kind of a bizarre thing to say. It's kind of like when these guys first proposed the theory of gravity and everybody thought, oh, this sounds like magic. That's really weird. Or the theory of germs. That sounds like magic fairies. Okay, I know it might sound weird on the surface, but actually it's real. And many, many people have experienced it. So Saul experiences this, and I want to point out, too, that Saul is actually a man who is prepared to listen to God. Even though up to this point in his life, he has not actually heard from God directly, he's been reading the Bible and he's been trying the best that he can to do what he thinks God wants him to do, even though he's way off on the wrong track. And because of that, because of actually where his heart is at, this is one of the reasons that God speaks to him. We've said this a number of times in this sermon series and before, that God is actually looking for people who really want to know him. They actually, deep down in their hearts, desire to know if he's real. And they're honest about that. And if he were real, they would be prepared to actually follow him. If that becomes true of you in your heart at any point in your life, God will speak to you. Jesus says it. He promises it. If you're seeking, you're truly seeking God, he will answer you. You will find him, because he will allow himself to be found by you. And that's the condition of Saul's heart here. How do we know that? Well, take a look at the last verse that I read. What does he do after this experience happens to him? You could actually imagine a different kind of response, couldn't you? And in fact, I am certain that there are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people, depends on how you count the level of dramatic experience that they've had, but many people in the history of the world and today who have had an experience, sometimes a dramatic experience where God was trying to get their attention, but once they had it, they decided to ignore it after it happened. They decided that that's just too crazy, I can't deal with it, or there are consequences to that experience. I'm actually going to have to change my life. I'm actually going to have to follow this God, and there are some things that I don't want that are part of that package. And so they've decided to ignore that experience. But Saul does not. You see that when this happens to him, he immediately goes into the city, and what did it say that he does? Tries to come up with some other explanation of how this happened. Oh, maybe I ate the wrong thing that morning. Maybe this didn't really happen. Maybe I was just sick and hallucinating. No, what he does is he does not eat or drink for 3 days. And this was, in his culture, in his religious practice, this was sort of an emergency, super seeking God method that they had. If you really, really, really needed God to answer you, you would kind of ramp yourself up into a mode of seeking him by not eating or drinking anything. Now, you've often heard it said that a human being cannot survive more than 2 days without water. That's not exactly true, but there is truth that you can't survive very long without water, right? Saul doesn't drink anything for 3 days. He becomes extremely, like as extreme as he can with his own physical life into seeking God mode. Into I want to know if that was really you, who that was. I want to know if you are real, if this person Jesus is actually alive, then I've got to know. I've got to know. And no doubt he is confused. You would also be confused if you had seen a bright light and heard a voice. That is not something that happens to people regularly in life, and so you would have no experience to kind of use to interpret that. And so you would be trying to figure out, did it really happen? What happened? What did the other people see? All of these kinds of questions are running through Saul's mind. And so the second point for your bulletin there is just this, that God speaks to those who are ready to listen. God speaks to those who are really ready to listen. Let's jump into the story of Ananias now for a minute. Let me read the next things that happen here. Because Saul needs help. He needs someone to corroborate this story. He needs confirmation that this was real, that there actually is this, that Jesus really is alive, and that that's who spoke to him. And so here's what happens next in the story. It says in verse 10, there was a follower. So a person who's following Jesus named Ananias, who lived in Damascus. And the Lord, that is Jesus, spoke to him in a vision. And Ananias answered and said, Lord, here I am. The Lord said to him this. The Lord gives him, Jesus, in this vision, gives this guy very specific instructions. Get up and go to the house of Judas on Straight Street. He gives an address. Could you imagine if God actually gave you an address? Go to 4323 124th Street, and I want you to knock on the door behind the house. Okay. He gives him an address. Go to the house of Judas on Straight Street. When you get there, you will find a man named Saul from the city of Tarsus. Saul is praying. That's what he's spending his 3 days doing. And he has seen a vision. In the vision, he saw a man named Ananias, your name, coming to him and putting his hands on him so that he could see again. Now, Ananias knows why Saul is there, and so this is how Ananias answers. Lord, a lot of people have told me about the terrible things that this man has done to your followers in Jerusalem, and now the chief priests have given him power to come here and arrest anyone who worships in your name. So translation, are you serious, Lord? That's who you want me to go talk to? This guy's going to kill me. The Lord said to Ananias, go. I have chosen him to tell foreigners, kings, and people of Israel about me. I will show him how much he must suffer for worshiping in my name. Okay, we'll see what happens in that story in just a minute. But let's point out a couple of things about Ananias, and then one more story to bring it into real life today. Ananias clearly has what we always talk about in church. He has a relationship with God. In fact, he has a relationship with the person named Jesus, even though he can't physically see Jesus. You can see that because Jesus appears to him or somehow communicates to him in a vision. We don't know what that was. Maybe it was a dream in this case, or maybe there's some other just really clear circumstances in his life, or maybe it's just a strong impression in his mind. We're not sure. But Jesus communicates to him in a vision, and his immediate response is not, "Who are you?" like Saul's. His immediate response is, "Yes, I'm here and I'm listening." This is a voice or a communication that he recognizes. He recognizes it. And so what I want to say here, and this is the third point for your bulletin notes today, is this: a relationship with God is not a metaphor. It is different, but it is real. I don't know how I want to get this across as strongly as I possibly can. When we say you can have a relationship with God because of what Jesus has done, by dying for us on the cross and coming back to life. Because of what he's done, if you put your trust in him and step out in faith, you can know God, you can have a relationship with him. When we say that, we are not using a metaphor. We're not saying you can kind of have something that might be like a relationship. We are saying you can have an actual relationship with God. An actual one. Where you communicate with him and he communicates with you. I know that sounds like magic fairies to some people here. You communicate with him and he communicates with you, and you know each other and can recognize each other's communication. And he's doing things in your life and you're doing things to help him with the mission that he's on. You can have an actual relationship with God. Okay? Now, does stuff like this happen today? We've already addressed this a little bit with Saul, but I want to address this because I know that some people in here are thinking, some people watching online may be thinking, okay, possibly this happened 2,000 years ago to Ananias, but does stuff like this actually happen? And what I want to say to you again is this, that this is a highlight moment. The dramatic kind of thing that happens here to Ananias does not happen very often. It didn't happen very often then either. When we look at the Bible, we're looking at, these are the big moments that happen that we really want to remember and that you can base your faith on. There were lots of more, less dramatic kinds of communications regularly between Ananias and the Lord Jesus, who was not visibly there. But this sort of stuff does still happen. Okay, I'm going to share with you right now the most dramatic example from my life of a time when God communicated something specific to me. And what I'm doing is the same thing that Luke is doing here in recording this story. I'm not trying to say to you, God's going to do this all the time in your life. The story I'm about to share with you is something that God did one time in my life. Just once so far. It was a very clear communication, and I think it's kind of undeniable that it was a communication from God. But I'm sharing it so that you can see it's real and possible, and then maybe be able to recognize the less dramatic times when God is speaking to us in our lives. Okay? So I'm going to set this up, and don't put the first slide until I say, okay? So, this happened. I'm going to give you as many details as I can because I want you to see that this is real. 2015, this happened. Okay? I was at another church in Vancouver. I was the associate pastor there. There was no senior pastor. Something happened in that church. It was kind of a relational problem that was going on in the church. Basically, a guy who had been a leader in the church but had been gone for a long time and was a really charismatic personality came back to the church. Okay? His name is Naresh. Naresh, if you're watching, hey, what's up, man? He lives in Burnaby. Okay? He came back to the church after he'd been gone for a long time. Some people in the church were super excited by that because he had a lot of gifts and abilities. And other people in the church were less excited by that because they were maybe afraid that he was going to go a different direction than they wanted, or, they weren't sure how it was going to be. So all of a sudden, it seemed like the whole church was focused on this one guy named Naresh. Now, right at that time, I thought about what should my involvement with this be? And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to cause problems if I get too involved with this. So I said, I'm not going to be involved with this. I'm just going to let other leaders sort it out. Okay? The day after he came back, I went for a run. I often go for runs and kind of pray while I'm on a run. I went for a run around the Langara Golf Course in East Vancouver. How many people have been there? Langara Golf Course? Okay, on that run, I stopped by what used to be the Sexsmith Elementary School playground. And I was at that playground, I was talking to God, I wasn't hearing anything, nothing unusual. I wasn't talking to God about this situation. I was just talking to God saying, Lord, I love you. Is there anything you want to say to me right now? I want to know you. Things that I often say to God. And I look down, and on the ground next to my feet is this first picture. Put up the first slide. On the ground next to my feet is an envelope that in large red letters has the word Naresh written across it. This is one day after he had come back to the church. One day. All right, so I'm freaking out in this moment. And in fact, I'll show you this here. This is the envelope, okay? This really happened. All right? I saved this because it's a highlight moment for me. It says Naresh. Now, obviously, it's some sort of business. It's actually an East Indian food supply company in the river district in East Vancouver. But it's sitting there by itself. There's nothing else around it. It's an empty envelope. That's it. I sit there and I'm praying. I'm saying, Lord, what are you trying to communicate to me? And I probably spent 5 to 10 minutes there just talking to God. What are you trying to say to me? Okay, Naresh, I get that much. I'm smart enough to figure that out. But finally, I'm looking around, seeing, is there anything else? Is there anything else around? And so I finally say to God, I say, look, I really want to know what you're saying to me. I don't understand what you want me to do. If you want me to do something with Naresh, you're going to have to tell me what you want me to do. Okay? Just make it clear, and then I'll do it. Even if it's scary, I'm going to do it. Okay? So I start back on my run. And within 50 feet, my foot lands on this next picture. Go ahead and hit the next slide. I am not kidding. Here it is right here. My foot, I look down and realize I'm stepping on a laminated piece of paper. Obviously, it's from the school, but again, there's nothing else around it anywhere. It's just laying on the ground, and it says, whoops, I got it upside down. It says, phone, please. Okay, now, I admit, and you're learning something about God here because he's kind of weird sometimes. He's kind of funny. This is actually the kind of communication I've learned to expect from God. Not laminated pieces of paper, but communications that often, many of you know this, often when God speaks, you go, what? What? Really? Okay. That's what it feels like to hear from God often. So I called him, and God did a lot of things through that. Actually, God built me up through a relationship that lasted a number of years after that, and actually helped me to do something about a year later that was really, really hard for me to do in my life through that obedience to that direct instruction. So this does happen today. God is communicating with you, and I would put this forward to you. God is communicating with you in different ways every single day. In fact, I bet you he's communicating with us far more than we can even imagine. And most of it we're missing. Now, why? It is different than communicating with a human being who's physically in front of you. It is quite different. I'll admit that, and Jesus even says that. Like I said, he spent time preparing his disciples for the fact that it would be significantly different. But it is real. So let me say a couple things just about how, then, we hear from God. How does God speak to us? Some of these are my own thoughts. Some of this comes from a great book called Hearing God by a guy named Dallas Willard. But we'll just say a couple things about how does God speak to us. Here are some different ways that he does that are less dramatic and more ordinary. God speaks to us through the Bible. And by that, I do not only mean you read the Bible and understand what it says. I mean that often you'll read something in the Bible and it will take hold of you. Almost as if something from outside of you were speaking through it. This happens regularly in the lives of people who are actively following Jesus. God speaks to us not only through the Bible, but through a kind of inner voice. Now, you don't just want to go around telling people you're hearing voices. That's kind of a bad idea. But if you have been following Jesus and seeking him for any length of time, you will have recognized that sometimes there's a certain feeling or sometimes thoughts and impressions that come to you that seem like they're not from yourself. For some people, they happen more often, some people less. God speaks to each person in different ways, actually. And that's because we are quite different. And so we don't want to set up one way and say, this is the only way God speaks and other people are bad. No, that's not the case. God also speaks to us through other people. And I don't just mean that what other people are saying is God speaking. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that often, if you're seeking God, you will hear another person say something, and often something will come to you and take hold of you that wasn't even necessarily what that other person meant to communicate. That may happen to you today in this message. You may receive a communication from God that's not even what I intend to communicate. When that happens, it is the Holy Spirit working. Other people's circumstances. You saw that in my story in a very dramatic way. It doesn't mean that everything that happens to you is a message from God, no. But sometimes the things that happen to you communicate something to you from God. And then finally, sometimes there are special experiences. And we saw that in our story with Ananias and with Saul, right? Special experiences. But those are rare. Those are actually very rare. And there are good reasons for that, that God makes them rare, and we won't get into that today. Second piece I want to say here is, what does the voice of God sound like? How can we recognize it? How can we learn to hear his voice? And just throw out a few things to you here, because as each of those different areas, different ways that God speaks to us, the Bible, and sort of an inner voice, other people, circumstances, special experiences, not all of those, all the time, are God communicating to us. How can we recognize his voice? And there's a couple of ways. It takes time to learn to recognize his voice. But first of all, you can recognize it by what it sounds like. I know it sounds weird, but when you listen to someone else, how do you recognize someone's voice? By what it sounds like, right? Well, what does the voice of God sound like? I don't mean sounds, that's why I have it in quotations there. I don't mean that you actually hear it with your ears. Typically, if you hear a voice with your ears, you should come talk to your pastor and then go see a psychiatrist. But, not always, but typically. But when you think you might be receiving communication from God, what does that sound like? What it sounds like, the voice of God, I'll say a couple things. It sounds big. It also sounds gentle. And it sounds firm. And those of you who have experienced it know what I mean. It's bigger than anything it just feels massive. A young man I was helping disciple in Christ once, when he first heard the voice of God, he said it sounded like, or it felt like, it was so big that it could obliterate the earth. That was his experience of that voice. Yes, that is an indication it's the voice of God. Second, what does it feel like? Voices have a certain quality. They communicate the kind of person who's speaking just by the voice. The voice of God feels like Jesus feels. It feels like peace and joy and love. And it often feels like a little bit of fear, but a really good fear. An exciting kind of fear. Just like you could see that Saul must have had and Ananias had, right? Go talk to this guy who's coming here to kill you, because I'm going to do something through you. Ananias he's not tempted to disobey. He's ready to obey God, but he's scared of that, right? But he's also excited by it at the same time. That's what the voice of God feels like. In fact, almost every time, that's what it feels like. And many of you in the room know that that's the case. Even when it's little things, it might be just something you need to change in your life, but if it feels like that, if it feels like peace, like it's right, like it's good, and like it's hard but excitingly scary, it's very likely the voice of God speaking to you. And then finally, what does it say? If you hear a voice that tells you to do something bad, it's not God, okay? We can just say that right off. If it's saying the kinds of things you would expect God to say, and often those things, like I said, are surprising, a little bit scary. They'll stretch you. They'll cause you to grow. These are all indications that it might be the voice of God. If you think you're receiving a communication from God, you don't always have to do this. Some things are just straightforward. God's telling me to clean up something in my life. Well, you just do it. You don't need to go and think about ask my friends or my pastor, is this really the voice of God? But if you think God is telling you to do something specific, you should probably get other people involved with that so that they can help you figure out, is that really what's going on here? But I want to lay this out because this is real, and we see it in the story this morning. Okay, so as we wrap up, a couple of points that I want to leave with you. What happens in that story, of course, is that Ananias does listen to God. And he goes and he prays for Saul, and something like scales fall out of Saul's eyes, and Saul's able to see again. This confirms for Saul that it was actually Jesus that spoke to him. And then through Saul, thousands and thousands of people all over the Mediterranean world become Christians over the next 30 years, become followers of Jesus. And so because Ananias has this relationship with God, and he's willing to listen and step out on what he hears God saying to him, massively powerful things, powerful forces for good are released into the world. And that, I want to just paint a picture for, if you've been following Jesus for a long time, that is what can happen with us here today. It's the potential for any church, for any group of people who truly are following Jesus, it's their potential at any moment in time. If we were all people who were listening intently for God, trying to discern his voice and trying to follow his lead, and if we were doing that together, the Spirit could work through us at any moment in a powerful way that would change the people around us, that would defeat evil, that would release all kinds of power into the world. And so, Community of Hope Church, this is your potential right here today. But what it requires from us is listening. And then if you are a person who's not yet sure, I hope, if you're not yet sure who God is, who Jesus is, I hope this message hasn't freaked you out. I know it might strike you a little bit like magic fairies, but it's actually true. Jesus is really here, and he will actually communicate with you. And if you seek him, he will let you find him. Let's pray.